Friends, Richard Wolff here. Let me start with something Donald Trump will never admit. America didn't lose Hooters because of woke culture or changing tastes. It lost Hooters because the very economic ideology Trump worships, debt fueled corporate extraction, finally ate one of its own creations alive. And yes, it's almost poetic that the empire built on wings and women collapsed for the exact same reasons Trump's business ventures keep cratering: bad math, worse management, and an economic model that burns cash faster than it earns trust. Here's the twist nobody saw coming: Hooters wasn't killed by progress. It was killed by Trump style capitalism, the same model that promises freedom but delivers foreclosure, that sells nostalgia but leaves workers paying for someone else's yacht. And once you see the numbers, the entire collapse stops looking like a business failure and starts looking like a crime scene. Picture this cinematic image: a neon Hooters sign flickering above a half-empty parking lot, the orange glow struggling against the darkness like an economy pretending it's alive while every indicator screams otherwise. Inside, vinyl booths cracking, friars older than some employees, and debt schedules taped to office walls like hospital charts for a dying patient. This wasn't decline, it was slow motion euthanasia. Because when private equity firms operating on the same borrow, extract, escape playbook Trump bragged about for decades loaded Hooters with $376 million in debt, the fate of the chain was already sealed. Imagine owing $30 million a year just in interest before cooking a single wing. No restaurant survives that. No worker thrives under that. Yet Wall Street calls this efficiency. Trump calls it smart business. The founders of Hooters built a joke that became an empire. The financiers who followed turned that empire into collateral. They didn't improve the food. They didn't modernize the brand. They didn't protect the workers who kept the place running. They simply squeezed it until the walls peeled, until the lawsuits stacked up, until inflation hit and the company realized it couldn't raise prices without losing the only customers it had left: middle class men whose purchasing power has been eroded by the exact economic policies Trump insists are great for America. Here's another twist early on. While Trump ranted about saving American business, the Hooters collapse shows something opposite under the system he champions. Even a $1 billion cultural icon can be gutted from the inside like an abandoned mall. By 2024, stores shuttered. By 2025, bankruptcy. Not liquidation, just another corporate rearrangement designed to protect investors while workers get pink slips and communities get another empty building collecting dust on a highway exit. And yet, people still ask why the middle class feels like it's drowning. Look at Hooters, a symbol of outdated escapism, dragged into bankruptcy court by an economy built to benefit owners, not workers. A caricature of the very system Trump insists is the best in the world. Its fall isn't a side story, it's a mirror. What makes the Hooters story even more disturbing is how ordinary it became. This wasn't some freak accident of the market. It was a textbook case of an economy that would rather blame culture wars than admit its own structural failures. While the debt was piling up in boardrooms, out in the dining rooms, the real collapse was already visible in empty tables, aging regulars, and a generation that simply stopped caring. For decades, the business model was simple and brutally clear: cheap wings, cheap male fantasy, and the assumption that young men would never change. But the numbers began to whisper a different story. Traffic in the 1824 age bracket started to slide. Surveys showed younger consumers preferring places where they could actually talk, bring friends of all genders, not sit in a neon lit time capsule from 1987. The very demographic that was supposed to keep Hooters immortal just quietly walked away. Here's the twist: while right wing pundits screamed that Hooters was being killed by woke millennials, the data showed something far less dramatic and far more damning. People weren't offended, they were bored. They had better options. Buffalo Wild Wings built over 1,000 locations by doing one thing Hooters never took seriously: being a good sports bar. Dozens of screens, craft beers, layouts built for groups and fantasy leagues, families showing up in team jerseys, no culture war needed, just a better product. Then came Wingstop with more than 2,000 locations and a laser focus on flavor, convenience, and delivery. While Hooters was still arguing with itself about how short the shorts should be, Wingstop turned wings into a scalable, modern, tech friendly business. The so called boobs and beer formula that once looked invincible was suddenly trapped between chains that were better at being restaurants and chains that were better at being sports temples. Hooters was neither. It was stuck in the middle, like a VHS tape in a streaming world. Picture another cinematic frame: two strip mall units side by side. On the left, a freshly remodeled Buffalo Wild Wings, packed on Sunday, golden light spilling out onto the sidewalk, wall to wall, screens cheering, in sync with a last minute touchdown. On the right, a tired Hooters, fluorescent lighting humming, a handful of older patrons staring at muted TVs, waitresses forced to smile through half empty shifts, while managers quietly panic over nightly sales targets they no longer hit. That's not just branding, that's economic obsolescence. Management's response: confusion dressed up as strategy. On paper, they tried to go family friendly, new salads, kids' menus, talk of being a sports first concept. In practice, they doubled down on the only gimmick they understood. In 2021, they rolled out even more revealing shorts, so tight workers compared them to underwear. When the backlash exploded on TikTok, it wasn't activists leading the charge, it was the employees themselves. The people carrying trays, cleaning tables, closing bills publicly, saying the uniform crossed the line. Instead of listening, executives treated the outrage as a PR problem to manage, not a warning flare about a broken culture. Shorts were made optional, but the message was clear: the brand would rather sacrifice dignity than rethink the model. And that's where the connection to the broader economic ideology becomes impossible to ignore. At the very moment the company needed investment in training, upgrading kitchens, improving food quality, and modernizing spaces, its cash was being siphoned off to service debt and satisfy investors. You see this pattern everywhere in this system: squeeze wages, stretch workers, defer maintenance, then act shocked when the product declines and the public drifts away. Hooters simply wore its contradictions on the outside, literally stitched into orange fabric. The empire built on the fantasy of endless demand ran straight into a generation that saw the whole thing for what it was, a relic of a time when the economy was allowed to treat people like props and call it entertainment. Underneath the neon and nostalgia, the collapse of Hooters wasn't just about a brand aging badly. It was a warning that an entire way of doing business, extractive, lazy, cynical, is running out of places to hide. Picking up from that unraveling, the final act of the Hooters saga exposes a deeper truth about the American economy, one that Donald Trump spent years glorifying while quietly embodying its most destructive instincts. Because once the cultural cracks formed and the competition outpaced them, Hooters still had one lifeline: reinvest, rebuild, modernize. But under the logic of Trump era financial capitalism, reinvestment is the last thing that happens. Instead, the brand was passed from owner to owner like a distressed asset on a clearance rack. Private equity firms didn't just buy Hooters, they hollowed it out. They extracted dividends, piled leverage onto the balance sheet, and forced the company to carry $376 million in debt it never asked for. That single number did more damage to Hooters than every lawsuit, every cultural shift, every competitor combined. This is the real twist. Hooters didn't die because young people rejected it. It died because Wall Street used it as an ATM and then blamed the customers for not showing up anymore. Inside the restaurants, the consequences were unavoidable. Maintenance budgets slashed, kitchens outdated, locations stuck with flickering signs, and booths older than the workers serving them. Training stripped down to the bare minimum, not because managers were careless, but because the money was gone. Every available dollar had been rerouted to service interest payments. Workers were told to smile more while the roof leaked behind them. Then inflation hit. Wing prices surged more than 80% in 2 years. Labor costs rose. And because the customer base was already thinning, Hooters couldn't raise prices without triggering a walkout. The chain wasn't just competing with food or sports anymore, it was competing with the basic math of a paycheck that no longer stretched to the end of the month. The same macroeconomic pressure crushing working Americans was now crushing a brand that once catered to them. Management tried everything: Hoot Swings, ghost kitchens, digital rebrands, but these were the corporate equivalent of bailing water with a paper cup. The ghost kitchens revealed the most humiliating truth of all: 75% of online customers had never once visited a physical Hooters. They weren't returning to the brand, they were avoiding it entirely. The company had successfully launched new names, new menus, new digital storefronts, but none of it brought people back into the orange and white reality that private equity had left behind. And then came the collapse. 2024, 40 stores abruptly closed. 2025, Chapter 11, bankruptcy filed. A restructuring masked as a fresh start, but everyone knew what it really was: an emergency landing after years of financial freefall. And here's where the irony becomes almost cinematic. After decades of corporate reshuffling and Wall Street engineering, The chain was handed back in fragments to one of the original founders, Neil Kiefer, a man who had spent years criticizing the very private equity model Trump once called genius. Now he was left to pick up the pieces of a brand still carrying the bruises of a system that prized debt over durability, extraction over stability, image over reality. His proposed fix: strip away the explicit gimmicks, rebuild community ties, repair reputation with charity and public engagement, bring back original recipes, original pricing logic, original culture, everything the financial engineers erased when they squeezed the brand for parts. But here's the final image, the one that lingers: a shuttered Hooters sign lying on the pavement beside a half demolished storefront, wires exposed, dust drifting in the afternoon sun. Workers passing by in silence, each one carrying the weight of another job lost to an economy that treats people as disposable and nostalgia as collateral. A brand that once laughed at itself is now being forced to confront the brutal arithmetic of a system that cannot stop devouring its own icons. The question isn't whether Hooters can be saved. The question is how many more American institutions will fall the same way, not because culture moved on, but because the economy stopped caring whether they lived or died.